Welcome, traveller, to a quieter time, a time when winter was not merely a season, but a test of faith itself. Tonight, we drift into the frozen hearts of medieval monasteries, where stone walls held prayers like ice holds memory, and warmth became something more than fire. In the darkness of winter cloisters, where frost gathered on altar stones and breath became visible prayer, monks discovered that survival was an act of devotion. We journey now into their world, not of comfort, but of endurance, not of heat, but of a warmth born from faith and the quiet ingenuity of souls who chose cold stone over earthly ease. The wind through empty corridors, the bite of flagstone beneath bare feet, the rhythm of bells in frozen air, these become our companions as we step backward through centuries. Before we slip into this hushed passage through winter's hold on medieval devotion, I ask a small favor of you. If you would, gently tap that like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these nighttime journeys into forgotten corners remain part of your evenings. Drop a comment if you're moved to. Tell me where you find yourself tonight. What hour marks your day or night, whether you watch from lamplight or darkness, from waking or drifting. Now dim whatever lights surround you, perhaps let a soft fan hum in the background if that soothes you, and settle deeply into this slow exploration of how faith kept winter at bay. What did it mean to choose cold as a path to God? How did men survive in chambers that seemed designed to break the body? What small rebellions of warmth occurred in silence, unrecorded, passed between brothers like whispered heresies? The year is sometime near 1230, and snow has buried the roads of northern France. Within thick walls of grey stone, a community lives by bells and breath, by prayer and the endless repetition of ritual. Their world is small, a cell, a corridor, a chapel, and winter makes it smaller still, pressing inward like a slow embrace. Let us begin where they began each day. In darkness, in cold, in the moment before the bell. You wake to the sound of a single bell, its note cutting through the frozen dark like a blade through cloth. The air in your cell bites immediately, not gradually, but all at once, as if the cold has been waiting patiently for you to surface from sleep. Your breath rises in slow clouds, grey against deeper grey, and you watch it drift toward the stone ceiling before vanishing. The straw beneath you has shifted in the night, bunched uncomfortably beneath your hip. And when you reach to adjust it, your hand finds the damp patches where moisture from your own body has condensed and frozen. This mattress, a cloth sack stuffed with last autumn's straw, was replaced only once since the harvest, and it carries the faint, earthy smell of decay mixed with the sharper scent of mildew. You sit up slowly, and the wool of your habit scrapes against your skin. It has not been washed in weeks. Water is too precious in winter, too difficult to heat, and the rule discourages such attentions to the body. The fabric holds the accumulated salt of labor and prayer, stiff in places, soft in others, and it provides the only layer between your flesh and the morning's assault. The floor beneath your feet is flagstone, each piece cut and fitted by hands long dead, and it pulls heat from your soles with startling efficiency. You know this sensation intimately now, have learned to walk quickly, lightly, keeping weight on the balls of your feet to minimize contact, but even so, the cold travels upward through bone, settling into your knees, your hips, reminding you that warmth is not a right, but a memory. Your cell is perhaps 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, though you have never measured it. The walls are bare stone, unadorned except for a simple wooden cross hung near the door, its grain barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. A single narrow window, no wider than your hand, cuts through the thick wall, not for light, which is scarce, but for air, though what enters is hardly a gift. Through that opening, You can hear the wind moving across the Abbey grounds, a low moan that never quite ceases. It finds every crack in the stone, every gap in the wooden door, and it brings with it the smell of snow and wood smoke from the distant kitchen. Somewhere the lay brothers are already awake, tending the fires that feed the community, fires you will feel only indirectly, only briefly, as you pass through certain corridors or gather for meals in the refectory. You reach for the woolen blanket you slept beneath, a single layer, coarse and grey, woven by hands in the Abbey's own workshop. It is damp at the edges where your breath condensed against it through the night, and when you fold it and place it at the foot of your bed, it feels heavier than it should. Some brothers, in the deepest months, sleep with this blanket wrapped around their shoulders, their habits pulled over their heads, curled tightly to conserve what little warmth the body produces. But the rule is clear: comfort is a distraction, softness a path away from God. And so you rise, barefoot and cold, and you prepare to join your brothers in the first office of the day. The corridor outside your cell stretches in both directions, lit only by a few rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat that burn with an uncertain, smoky flame. These lights do little to warm the space. They merely carve small pockets of amber from the surrounding black. The stone walls glisten faintly with condensation, and in places you can see the delicate tracery of frost forming geometric patterns like the work of an invisible artisan. You walk with measured steps, joining the slow procession of figures emerging from their own cells. No one speaks. The rule of silence governs these hours, but you hear the shuffle of bare feet, the rustle of habits, the occasional soft cough or clearing of throat. These sounds echo strangely in the stone passage, repeating and overlapping until they seem less like human noise and more like the breathing of the building itself. The chapel is darker than the corridor, vast and cold and filled with the scent of old incense and damp stone. You find your place in the choir stalls, wooden benches worn smooth by generations of monks, and you kneel. The wood is so cold it burns, and you feel it through the fabric of your habit, a steady ache that becomes part of the prayer. Matins begins with a single voice. The cantor, his breath visible in the candlelight, his words rising into the vaulted darkness above. You join the response, and the sound of many voices in unison creates a strange warmth, not of body, but of presence. The air thickens with breath, with the shared exhalation of prayer, and for a moment the cold recedes slightly, held back by the collective act of devotion. But the moment passes. The office lasts an hour, perhaps more, and as you chant the Psalms, verses you know by heart, verses that have become as familiar as your own heartbeat, the cold settles back in. Your knees ache against the kneeler, your back stiffens, your fingers grow numb as you grip the edges of your wooden breviary. The pages are stiff with cold, and turning them requires care. In deep winter, the parchment can crack. When matins ends, there is no return to sleep. The day has begun, and with it, the endless round of duties and prayers that structure every hour. You file out of the chapel with your brothers, moving silently through the cloister, the covered walkway that surrounds the central courtyard, open to the weather on one side, a fragile boundary between shelter and exposure. Snow has drifted into the cloister during the night, small mounds of white against the grey stone, and your feet leave dark prints as you pass. The wind moves through the arched openings, carrying with it the scent of pine from the forests beyond the Abbey walls, the sharp smell of ice, and underneath it all, the faint mineral odour of stone itself. Ancient, patient, unyielding. You return to your cell to wait for Lord's, the next office, which will come as dawn begins to pale the eastern sky. There is perhaps an hour, no more, and you spend it in stillness. Some brothers pray privately, some read from their breviaries by the dim light of a single candle, some simply sit, conserving energy, existing in that strange state between waking and sleeping that becomes second nature here. You pull the blanket around your shoulders and sit on the edge of your straw mattress, your back against the cold wall. Your hands you tuck into the sleeves of your habit, and you breathe slowly, deliberately, watching your breath form and dissolve. There is a rhythm to this, breath in, breath out, each exhalation a small loss of warmth, each inhalation a cold reminder of where you are. Outside, the sky is beginning to lighten, though the sun will not rise for some time yet. The window, slit in your cell, frames a rectangle of deep blue, fading slowly to grey, and you watch it change as the minutes pass. This small window is your only connection to the world beyond these walls, and in winter it shows you little. Snow, clouds, the bare branches of distant trees, and sometimes the dark shapes of birds moving against the pale sky. The bell sounds again, calling you to Lord's, and you rise once more. Your body protests, joints stiff, muscles tight with cold, but you move through the discomfort as you have learned to do. Pain here is not something to be avoided, but something to be acknowledged and then released, offered up as part of the daily sacrifice. Lord's is shorter than Matins, but no warmer. The chapel has not had time to gather any heat from the bodies that filled it earlier, and the stone seems to drink in whatever warmth you bring, leaving you colder when you leave than when you arrived. The chanting continues, voices rising and falling in ancient patterns, and you lose yourself in the repetition, in the familiar words that require no thought, only breath and sound. After Lord's comes Prime, and after Prime, Chapter. The morning meeting where the abbot addresses the community, where faults are confessed and penances assigned, where the work of the day is distributed. You gather in the chapter house, another cold chamber, and you listen to the abbot's voice echoing off stone walls. His breath, like yours, is visible in the air, small clouds that punctuate his words. The work assigned today is typical for winter. Some brothers will copy manuscripts in the scriptorium, though the ink must be kept from freezing. Others will tend to repairs in the abbey, small tasks of maintenance that never end. Some will work in the bakery or the brewery, where the heat of ovens and fermenting grains provides a rare respite from the cold. You are assigned to the scriptorium, and you accept this silently, knowing it means hours of sitting still, fingers gripping a quill, eyes straining in dim light. But first, there is breakfast. You file into the refectory, a long hall with tables and benches, and you take your place. The meal is simple, bread, hard and coarse, baked in large loaves that must be broken with effort, a thin porridge of oats and water, and ale, thick and cold, that tastes of yeast and grain. There is no butter, no honey, no meat. These are luxuries reserved for feast days, and winter is not a season of feasting. You eat in silence, listening to the reader who stands at a lectern, reciting from scripture in a measured, monotonous voice. The food is difficult to swallow. The bread is so dry it scrapes your throat. The porridge is bland and barely warm, but you eat because you must, because the body requires fuel, even when it cannot be warmed. The refectory has a hearth, a small fire burning at one end, but you are seated far from it, and the heat it produces barely reaches you. When the meal ends, you rinse your wooden bowl and spoon in a basin of cold water, your hands plunging into liquid that feels like knives against the skin. You dry them on your habit, and then you make your way to the scriptorium. The scriptorium is a long room with high windows that let in the pale light of winter. Rows of wooden desks face the windows, each with a slanted surface for writing, a small shelf for pigments and tools, and a stool. You take your place at your assigned desk, and you prepare your materials. The ink pot must be thawed overnight. The ink has frozen solid, and you must warm it under your habit, holding it against your body until the liquid loosens. This takes time, and while you wait, you arrange your parchment, your quills, your knife for scraping mistakes. The parchment is stiff and brittle in the cold, and you must handle it gently, warming each sheet with your breath before you begin to write. When the ink is finally fluid, you dip your quill and begin. The task today is copying a psalter, word by careful word, line by careful line. Your hand moves slowly, forming letters with precision, but the cold makes this difficult. Your fingers grow numb quickly, and you must stop often to warm them, blowing on them, rubbing them together, tucking them under your arms. The quill is hard to grip, and more than once it slips, leaving a blot on the page that you must carefully scrape away. The light from the windows is weak and grey, and you must lean close to see your work. Your back aches from the posture, your eyes strain, and the cold seems to seep into your bones through the wooden stool, through the stone floor, through the very air itself. Around you, other brothers work in the same silence. The only sounds the scratch of quills on parchment, the occasional scrape of a knife, the soft rustle of pages turning. Hours pass this way. There is no clock, no way to mark time except by the bells that call you to the next office. Terce comes and goes, then sext, each one a brief interruption in the work, a walk to the chapel and back, another hour of standing and kneeling and chanting, another small accumulation of cold. By midday, your hands are so numb you can barely hold the quill. The ink has thickened again, sluggish in the cold, and the letters you form are uneven, imperfect. You know you will have to redo much of this work, but you continue because stopping is not an option. The rhythm of work, like the rhythm of prayer, is what holds the day together, what gives shape to time that would otherwise stretch unbearably. Lunch is a repeat of breakfast, bread, porridge, ale, silence. Your stomach accepts the food without pleasure, and you return to the scriptorium with the weight of it sitting heavily inside you. The afternoon light is even weaker than the morning, and by the time none is called, the mid-afternoon office, you are working almost by feel, your eyes tired and dry, your body a collection of aches and stiffness. Vespers comes as the light fades entirely, and Compline follows soon after. These evening offices have a different quality. The day's work is behind you, and the prayers feel like a gradual descent, a lowering into night. The chapel is completely dark now, except for candles, and their small flames create shifting shadows that dance across the vaulted ceiling, as if the prayers themselves have taken form. After Compline, you return to your cell for the last time. The evening meal, if it can be called that, was a piece of bread and a cup of water, taken standing, and now there is nothing between you and sleep, except the slow process of settling your body into stillness. You remove your sandals, though you have worn them rarely today, and you lie down on the straw mattress, pulling the damp blanket over you. The darkness is complete, and the silence is broken only by the wind and the distant sound of someone coughing in another cell. You lie on your side, knees drawn up, hands tucked between your thighs, trying to create a small pocket of warmth within the folds of your habit. The straw beneath you crackles softly as you shift, searching for a position that might be less uncomfortable, though you know from experience that no such position exists. Sleep comes slowly, fitfully. You drift in and out, aware always of the cold, of the hardness of the bed, of the way your body aches in a dozen places. And then, too soon, the bell sounds again, pulling you back into waking, back into the cycle that will repeat tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The rhythm of winter days in the monastery is like the rhythm of waves on a distant shore, constant, unchanging, wearing away at stone with patient persistence. You do not think of spring because spring is too far away to imagine. You do not think of warmth because warmth is a distraction. You think only of the next office, the next prayer, the next moment of endurance. And somewhere, deep within the cold and the silence and the endless repetition, you find something that might be warmth, not of the body, but of the spirit, a small flame that burns without fuel, without light, known only to you. It is this warmth you tend, this warmth you protect, this warmth that makes survival possible when everything else argues for surrender. The walls around you hold the prayers of generations, the breath of countless monks who lived and died in these same cold cells. Their warmth, too, is here, not in the stone, which remembers nothing, but in the continuity of devotion, in the unbroken chain of bell and prayer and silence that stretches backward through centuries and forward into a future you cannot see. You close your eyes and you breathe, and you wait for sleep to come. The cold presses in, patient and impartial, and you press back with the only weapon you have, faith that this suffering has meaning, that this endurance is a form of prayer, that warmth will come, if not in this life, then in the next. In the winter of 1149, a young monk named Gerard arrived at the Abbey of Clairvaux, his sandals worn through from the journey, his habit soaked with snow that had fallen for 3 days without ceasing. He came from the south, from a region where winter was a brief interlude between harvests, where frost lasted only until mid-morning, and the olive trees stood green against December skies, and he was unprepared for what awaited him in the frozen valleys of Champagne. The landscape he had travelled through had transformed day by day, the gentle hills of his homeland giving way to steeper valleys, the air growing sharper with each league northward. By the time he reached the Abbey gates, the world had become a place of white and grey, all colour leached away by the relentless snowfall. The trees stood bare and black against the snow, their branches weighted down until some cracked with sounds like distant thunder. The abbot who received him was Bernard of Clairvaux, a man whose reputation for severity was matched only by his reputation for holiness. He stood in the entrance hall of the monastery, a tall figure with a face that seemed carved from the same stone as the walls around him, his eyes bright and penetrating despite the shadows. Bernard looked at the young man standing before him, shivering, exhausted, still carrying the warmth of the outside world in his eyes like a man who has not yet learned what he is leaving behind. And he said simply, "You have chosen the narrow path. May God grant you the strength to walk it." The words were not unkind, but neither were they comforting. They held the weight of experience, of winters survived, of countless young men who had arrived at these gates with hope and fear mingled in their hearts. Gerard heard in them both a blessing and a warning. Gerard was assigned a cell in the novices' wing, a section of the monastery built against the north wall, where the sun never reached in winter and where the wind found every crack and crevice in the ancient masonry. The stones of this wing were older than the rest, laid down in a time when the abbey was smaller, when monks lived with even less comfort than they did now. His cell was identical to all the others, a narrow space barely 6 feet by 8, with a straw mattress that seemed thin as parchment, a wooden cross hanging on the wall above the bed, a single window with a wooden shutter that fit poorly in its frame, and nothing else. He was given his habit, rough wool that smelled of lye and lanolin, his sandals of wood and leather that would provide little protection against the cold stone floors, his breviary with its worn leather binding, and pages soft from countless hands. He was told that his first obligation was silence, his second was obedience, and his third was the acceptance of discomfort as a path to God. These words were delivered by the master of novices, an older monk with a face weathered by time and discipline, who spoke with the calm authority of someone who had long ago made peace with hardship. The first night he could not sleep. The cold was unlike anything he had known, not the sharp, temporary cold of a winter night in the open air, where one could build a fire or wrap oneself in blankets and wait for dawn, but a deep, persistent cold that seemed to come from the stone itself, as if the walls were not merely cool, but actively hostile to warmth. He lay on his mattress, his teeth chattering so violently he feared they would crack, his body curled so tightly his muscles cramped and burned, and he wondered what madness had brought him here. He had left behind a life that now seemed impossibly distant, a family home with a hearth that burned year-round, meals that filled the belly, the simple comfort of warmth taken for granted. In the darkness of his cell, with frost forming on the inside of the walls and his breath visible in the moonlight that filtered through the ill-fitting shutter, that former life seemed like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. The cold was the only reality, immediate and absolute. In the morning, the master of novices found him still awake, hollow-eyed and pale, his lips faintly blue, despite his efforts to warm himself. The master said nothing, only gestured for Gerard to follow, and together they walked through the frozen cloister to the chapel. Their footsteps echoed on the stone, the only sound in the pre-dawn darkness. The master knelt, and Gerard knelt beside him, and together they prayed through the pain of cold knees on cold stone, until the bell called them to matins, its voice carrying across the Abbey grounds like a cry through the frozen air. This became Gerard's education, not in theology or scripture, though those would come in time, but in the fundamental lesson of monastic life, that the body is a stubborn student, but it can be taught. Each day he woke to the bell that rang in darkness, its sound penetrating even the thickness of sleep, and each day the cold struck him anew like a physical blow, and each day he learned to endure it a little longer before his body rebelled. The learning was incremental, measured not in understanding but in seconds and minutes, an extra moment before rising, an extra breath before moving, a gradual accommodation between flesh and circumstance. He wrote in a letter to his brother in the south words that would survive in fragments preserved by chance when the letter was copied into a collection of monastic correspondence. The flesh cries out for warmth as a child cries for its mother, with the same desperate need, the same certainty that suffering is unbearable. But the soul, when it learns to listen past the crying, hears a deeper voice, a voice that says, "Be still, be cold, be nothing, that you might become something." The winter deepened, snow piled against the walls of the Abbey, until the ground-floor windows were half buried, until the world outside became an undifferentiated whiteness that erased the boundaries between earth and sky, and the paths between buildings had to be cleared daily by lay brothers wielding wooden shovels, their faces wrapped in cloth, their movements slow and deliberate in the bitter air. The cold became not just an inconvenience but a presence, an adversary that tested every moment, every movement, every breath. It was there when they woke and there when they slept, there in the chapel and there in the refectory, an inescapable companion that never rested. In the scriptorium, where Gerard spent his mornings copying texts, first simple prayers, then more complex manuscripts, the ink froze in its pots despite efforts to keep it fluid. The brothers had tried everything, placing the pots near their bodies, covering them with cloth, mixing the ink with wine or ale to lower its freezing point. The brothers learned to work in shifts, each warming an ink pot under his habit, while another wrote, passing the warmed ink back and forth like a small, precious fire, a ritual of cooperation born from necessity. But even this was not always enough, and there were days when the work simply could not be done, when the parchment was too brittle to accept ink without cracking, when fingers were too numb to hold a quill with the precision that fine script demanded. Gerard watched the older monks, men who had endured 30 winters, 40 winters, men whose bodies bore the marks of decades in this place, and he saw that they moved differently, more slowly, more carefully, as if they had learned to conserve every motion, every breath, to husband their warmth as a miser husbands gold. They did not fight the cold, they existed within it, as fish exist within water, adapted to an environment that would kill an outsider quickly. Their faces showed a kind of calm he could not yet access, a peace that came not from comfort, but from acceptance. He began to imitate them. Instead of curling tightly at night, fighting the cold with tension, he learned to lie still, to relax his muscles even as they wanted to clench, to breathe slowly and deeply, creating a rhythm that calmed his body even as the cold pressed in from every direction. Instead of moving quickly through the corridors, trying to outrun the chill, he learned to walk with measured steps, to keep his hands tucked into his sleeves, to avoid unnecessary exposure to drafts and wind. Every movement became deliberate, economical. And he learned, too, the small rebellions that monks practiced in silence, the accommodations that existed in the space between rule and survival. He discovered that if he layered his habit with his blanket underneath, worn like a second tunic despite the awkwardness, he could trap a thin layer of air that held some warmth, a barrier between skin and cold. He learned that if he sat on his sandals during prayer, the wood provided insulation from the stone floor, a small mercy that made the long offices more bearable. He learned that if he breathed through the fabric of his sleeve, the exhaled warmth would linger for a moment before dissipating, and that moment was enough to ease the ache in his lungs. These techniques were never discussed openly. They existed in that grey space between rule and survival, tolerated by the abbot as long as they remained unspoken, as long as no one made the mistake of treating comfort as a right rather than a forbidden fruit taken in secret. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge that comfort mattered, and comfort was the enemy of holiness, the thing that kept the soul from its proper work. But to forbid them would be to condemn the community to needless suffering, and even Bernard, for all his severity, understood the difference between discipline and cruelty. The abbot's wisdom lay in what he chose not to see. The winter of 1149 became known in later chronicles as the Long Winter, the winter that tested the faithful and broke the weak. It began early, in October, with a cold rain that turned to sleet and then to snow, and it did not relent until late March, when the first, tentative thaw began. The roads became impassable, cutting the Abbey off from the outside world, and supplies that should have arrived did not come. Grain ran low, ale ran low, even wood for the essential fires in the kitchen became scarce, rationed like gold. The abbot called a meeting in the chapter house, and he addressed the community with characteristic directness, his breath clouding in the cold air as he spoke. "We will not starve," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, where the monks sat huddled on their benches, faces gaunt already from weeks of reduced rations. "But we will be hungry. We will not freeze, but we will be cold. This is not a punishment, it is an opportunity. God has given us winter to strip away what is unnecessary, to reveal what is essential. Let us embrace this gift." Gerard, listening from his place among the novices, felt something shift inside him. He had come to the Abbey seeking God, burning with a young man's fervour, expecting some dramatic transformation, but he had expected to find God in prayer, in Scripture, in moments of spiritual clarity that would descend like light from heaven. Instead, he was finding God in cold stone, in empty stomachs that cramped and growled, in the slow, wearing away of his own resistance. The suffering was not incidental to the spiritual life, it was the spiritual life, or at least a crucial part of it, the crucible in which faith was tested and refined. He began to keep a journal, writing by candlelight in his cell after Compline, when the day's silence deepened into night's silence, and the Abbey became a place of shadows and stillness. His observations were practical at first, notes on how to keep ink fluid, how to repair worn sandals with scraps of leather, how to identify which sections of the cloister offered the most shelter from wind based on the patterns of drifted snow. But gradually they became more reflective, more philosophical, as if the act of writing was helping him process what he was experiencing, turning suffering into meaning. "I have learned," he wrote on a page dated the Feast of St. Agnes, "that warmth is not the absence of cold, but the presence of something else, something that cannot be named, only felt, like grace or love or the movement of the Holy Spirit. The body knows cold, knows it as a threat and an enemy, but the soul knows warmth of a different kind. Perhaps this is what we seek here, not comfort, but the warmth that comes from knowing we have chosen this difficulty, this hardship, freely as an offering, as a way of saying to God, 'I give you everything, even my comfort, even my ease.'" One particularly bitter night in January, Gerard woke to find that his window shutter had blown open, torn from its fastenings by a wind that howled through the valley like a living thing, and snow had drifted into his cell. The straw mattress was dusted with white, already damp and growing colder by the moment. His blanket was damp and stiff with frost, and the cold was so intense that his lungs ached with each breath, as if the air itself had turned to knives. He rose, his body protesting every movement, and closed the shutter as best he could. The wood had warped from moisture and freezing, and it no longer fit properly in the frame, leaving gaps that let the wind whistle through. And then he stood in the darkness, shivering violently, wondering what to do. He could not return to his bed. It was too wet, too cold, and to lie on it now would be to invite sickness or worse. He could not go to another cell. That would violate the rule of enclosure, the understanding that each monk's cell was his hermitage, his place of solitary encounter with God. He could not light a fire. There was nowhere to light one, no hearth or brazier, and it would be forbidden even if there were, an indulgence that would mark him as weak. So he did the only thing left to him. He walked. He paced the small space of his cell, back and forth, arms wrapped around himself in a futile attempt at warmth, stamping his feet to drive blood into them, to keep the extremities from going numb. He walked until the worst of the shivering subsided, until his body generated enough heat from movement to stave off the immediate danger, and then he continued walking because to stop was to invite the cold back in, to surrender to the numbness that waited like a patient predator. He walked through the remaining hours until the bell for matins, his mind empty of everything except the rhythm of his steps and the slow count of his breaths, and when he joined his brothers in the chapel, he was exhausted but alive, his body having learned another lesson in survival, in the strange alchemy by which suffering transforms into endurance. The brother next to him in choir noticed his state. The dark circles under his eyes like bruises, the way he swayed slightly on his feet, the tremor in his hands as he held his breviary. And after the office, he leaned close and whispered, barely audible above the shuffling of sandals on stone, "Tonight, place straw between your door and the floor. It will stop the draught." Gerard nodded, grateful for the small kindness, for the acknowledgement that even in this place of silence and austerity, monks took care of one another, that fraternity existed alongside discipline. Winter wore on. Gerard's body changed. He lost weight until his habit hung loose on his frame. His face became gaunt. the bones standing out sharply beneath pale skin. His hands developed chilblains that cracked and bled, leaving red stains on the pages he copied. But his mind, paradoxically, became clearer, as if the stripping away of physical comfort had stripped away mental clutter as well. The constant discomfort had a way of focusing attention, of stripping away distractions, of making every moment immediate and present. When he prayed with an intensity he had never achieved in the comfort of his former life, when prayers had been words recited by rote. When he worked with complete absorption, because work kept the cold at bay, because the concentration required to form perfect letters was itself a kind of warmth. He began to notice details he had missed before, the way frost formed patterns on stone, each crystal a small miracle of geometry, a testament to the order hidden in nature, the way candlelight caught in the breath of praying monks creating halos of gold in the cold air, the way snow muffled sound turning the Abbey into a place of even deeper silence, as if the world itself had withdrawn into contemplation. The hardship was opening his perception, teaching him to see beauty in what he had previously thought was only suffering, to find grace in deprivation. In early February, illness swept through the community. It began with the oldest monks, men whose bodies had endured too many winters and had no reserves left, whose systems were worn down by decades of cold and insufficient food and the accumulated toll of austerity. One by one, they took to their beds in the infirmary, a slightly warmer room where a small brazier was permitted, where the rule was relaxed enough to allow for the mercy of heat. Gerard, as a young and relatively strong novice, was assigned to help care for them, to learn the work of mercy that was as much a part of monastic life as prayer. This work brought him face to face with death. He watched men die slowly, their bodies succumbing not to any dramatic illness, but simply to cold and exhaustion, to the slow winding down of systems that had run for 7 decades or more, as if they were candles burning down to nothing, their light guttering and failing. He washed their bodies, prepared them for burial with the simple dignity the rule prescribed, carried them to the cemetery where the ground was frozen so hard that graves had to be chipped out with picks, each grave taking a full day's labor by multiple brothers. One of the dying monks, Brother Anselm, called Gerard to his bedside in his final hours, when the rattle in his chest made clear that time was short. Anselm had been a monk for 40 years, and his body was a landscape of endurance, twisted fingers bent by arthritis, scarred feet that had walked countless miles on cold stone, a back bent from decades of kneeling in prayer. But his eyes were clear, possessed of a lucidity that seemed to intensify as the body weakened, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "You wonder why we live this way," Anselm said, not as a question, but as a statement, as if he could read the doubt that still flickered in Gerard's heart. Gerard did not reply, only waited, knowing that the old monk had something important to say. "We live this way because warmth, real warmth, the warmth of the soul, cannot be given. It must be found, and it is found not in fire, but in the burning away of everything that is not essential. You will understand in time. Anselm died that night, his final breath a soft sigh that barely disturbed the air, and Gerard sat with the body until morning, as was the custom, as was the honor owed to a brother. In the cold darkness of the infirmary, with only a single candle burning, its flame steady in the still air. He thought about the old monk's words. The burning away of everything that is not essential. Was that what winter was doing? To the Abbey, to the monks, to him? Was suffering simply a fire of a different kind, a purifying flame that consumed the dross and left only what was pure? By the time spring finally came, breaking the grip of winter in a slow thaw that turned the Abbey grounds into a sea of mud, that made the paths treacherous with melt and the air thick with the smell of earth awakening, Gerard had been transformed. He was no longer the young man who had arrived in snowfall, uncertain and afraid, clinging to memories of warmth and comfort. He was, in some essential way, a monk, someone who had learned to find warmth not in external comfort, but in the internal discipline of faith, in the knowledge that he could endure that he had endured. He wrote in his journal a passage that would be preserved and copied and passed down through generations of monks, that would be read aloud in chapter houses and cells, that would become part of the living tradition of Clairvaux. Winter teaches what summer cannot. In warmth, we are distracted by ease, by the body's contentment, by the thousand small pleasures that keep us from seeing clearly. In cold, we are stripped to the essentials: breath, prayer, the presence of God in suffering. I came here seeking holiness, expecting it to be something bright and beautiful, something that would fill me with joy. I found instead cold stone and empty bowls. But in the cold and the emptiness I found something that burns brighter than any fire, the knowledge that I am held, even in hardship, by a love that does not depend on comfort, that does not withdraw when conditions become difficult. Years later, when Gerard himself was an old monk, a master of novices tasked with guiding young men through their first harsh winters, he would tell them this story. He would describe that night when snow blew into his cell, when he walked until dawn to keep from freezing, when he thought he might not survive until morning, and he would say, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "That was the night I stopped fighting the cold. That was the night I understood that warmth is not something we find. It is something we become through the acceptance of what is, through the transformation of suffering into offering." He taught his novices the practical techniques, the layering of garments, the positioning during prayer, the breathing through fabric, but he taught them too the spiritual lesson. "The body will complain," he would say. "It will cry out for comfort as if comfort were necessary for life. But you will learn, as I learned, that there is a difference between comfort and necessity, between what we want and what we need. And you will learn that in the space between wanting and needing, between the body's demands and the soul's acceptance, there is room for God to work." Gerard died in winter, as many monks did, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated toll of decades of cold, of insufficient food, of the austere life he had chosen so many years before. He died in his cell, not in the infirmary, having requested to face death in the same small space where he had learned to live, where he had spent his first terrible night and countless nights thereafter. When his brothers came to prepare his body, they found him lying peacefully, his hands folded on his chest, his face serene in death as it had been in life, and on the small writing desk near his bed they found a scrap of parchment with words written in his familiar hand, still clear despite the tremor of age. "In silence, fire is born." They buried him in the cemetery in a plot among other monks, marked only with a simple wooden cross that bore his name and the years of his life, nothing more. The ground was frozen, as it always was in winter, and the work of digging was hard, requiring hours of labor, the pick ringing against the frozen earth. But the brothers did it gladly because Gerard had taught them, by his life, by his endurance, by his quiet example, that hardship accepted willingly becomes not a burden, but a gift, not a punishment, but a means of grace. The snow fell on his grave, covering it in white, erasing the freshly turned earth, making it indistinguishable from the graves around it, and the wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the sound of bells from the chapel. And in the cold air, in the silence between one bell and the next, his presence lingered, not as warmth exactly, but as something equally precious. The memory of a life lived in faithful endurance, of warmth found in the coldest of places, of a young monk who had learned that winter, for all its harshness, is also a teacher, and that the lessons it teaches are the ones the soul most needs to learn. In the ruins of medieval monasteries scattered across northern Europe, archaeologists have found something unexpected. Beneath the dormitories of Cistercian abbeys, under the flagstones of scriptoriums, within the thick stone walls of cloisters, there are channels, narrow passages carved into stone, ducts that once carried air, flues that suggest a hidden network of warmth. These discoveries are puzzling because they contradict the historical record in ways both subtle and profound. Monastic rules, particularly those of the Cistercians and Benedictines, explicitly forbade fires in private cells and discouraged comfort as a distraction from spiritual discipline. Yet here, in the physical remains, is evidence of sophisticated heating systems, not elaborate or extensive, but present nonetheless, whispering of a compromise between austerity and survival. The stone itself speaks what parchment never recorded, telling stories that the scribes, for reasons of their own, chose to leave unwritten. The silence of the written record is itself a kind of testimony. In hundreds of monastic chronicles, in thousands of letters exchanged between abbots, in the detailed customaries that governed every hour of monastic life, there is barely a mention of these heating systems. It is as if an entire infrastructure of warmth existed in a parallel dimension, visible to the eye, but invisible to the pen. This conspiracy of omission suggests something deeper than simple oversight. It points to a deliberate choice, a communal decision to preserve certain truths in stone rather than ink. At Clairvaux Abbey in Yorkshire, excavations revealed beneath the monks' dormitory a series of hollow channels running the length of the building. These channels connected to the warming house, a room where a fire was permitted for the community's collective use, and they carried heated air along the underside of the floor. The warmth provided would have been modest, barely enough to notice on the coldest nights, but in a world where any warmth was precious, even this ghost of heat would have mattered. A difference of a few degrees could mean the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness, between fingers that could hold a quill and fingers too numb to write. The engineering required for such a system was remarkably sophisticated. The channels had to be precisely angled to allow warm air to rise and circulate without creating drafts or losing too much heat to the earth below. The builders needed to understand principles of convection and thermal dynamics that would not be formally articulated for centuries. Yet here they are, carved into 12th century stone with a precision that speaks of experiential knowledge passed from master to apprentice across generations. Similar discoveries at Fountains Abbey, at Clairvaux itself, at Maulbronn in Germany, all suggest that medieval monks, for all their rhetoric of cold discipline, quietly engineered ways to make winter survivable. The systems were subtle, often disguised within existing architecture, and they were never mentioned in chronicles or letters. It was as if the community had agreed, without ever speaking the agreement aloud, that some warmths were necessary, even if they could not be acknowledged. This conspiracy of silence protected both the letter of the rule and the survival of those who lived under it. The pattern repeats across Europe with remarkable consistency. From the highlands of Scotland to the monasteries of the Swiss Alps, from Scandinavia to the Pyrenees, wherever monks established communities in regions of harsh winters, there appear these same subtle accommodations. The very consistency of the pattern suggests not isolated innovations, but a shared body of knowledge passed along networks of monastic correspondence and visitation. When an abbot travelled from one house to another, when masons moved from one building project to the next, they carried with them not just spiritual wisdom but practical secrets about survival. The very existence of these hidden systems raises profound questions about the gap between monastic ideology and monastic reality. What the abbots preached from chapter and what the masons built into stone were two different texts, written in two different languages, one visible and one encrypted in mortar and clay. This silence is revealing in ways that speech could never be. In medieval monastic culture, warmth existed in a strange moral territory, suspended between necessity and indulgence, between mercy and weakness. To seek it openly was prideful, a rejection of suffering's spiritual value. To provide it explicitly was to undermine the discipline that defined monastic life. But to arrange for it to appear as if by accident, as if by the natural result of other necessary structures, this was acceptable, even wise. The distinction was subtle but critical, a theological tightrope walked by communities that depended on such compromises for their very existence. The theology of suffering in medieval monasticism was complex and often paradoxical. Cold was understood as a form of mortification, a way of subduing the flesh and focusing the spirit on higher things. Yet excessive cold led to death, and death served no spiritual purpose if it came before the monk had achieved sanctity. The line between redemptive suffering and destructive suffering was real but often invisible, discovered only through the grim experience of loss. The warming house itself was a carefully regulated compromise, a space where the ideal and the practical met in uneasy truce. Every abbey had a single room where monks could gather after the coldest offices, where they could warm their hands briefly before returning to work or prayer. But the time allowed was limited, the fire modest, and the atmosphere deliberately cheerless. It was warmth as medicine, not warmth as pleasure. The warming house at Clairvaux, described in a 12th century customary, was to be heated only from November through Easter, and monks were permitted to enter only during specified hours. The fire itself was to be adequate but not abundant, a phrase that speaks volumes about the careful calibration required to balance mercy and discipline. The language used to describe the warming house reveals the careful parsing of permission and restriction. It was not a place for comfort, but for restoration, a term that implied temporary repair rather than sustained ease. Monks were to enter in silence, warm themselves with minimal fuss, and depart as quickly as possible. Any lingering, any evident enjoyment of the heat would be noted and corrected. Yet even within these restrictions, monks found ways to extend the gift. At some monasteries, the warming house was positioned strategically so that its chimney ran through walls adjacent to the scriptorium or the infirmary. The heat that escaped through stone was waste, technically an unavoidable byproduct of necessary fire, but it was waste that warmed scholars and the sick, and no rule forbade accepting what came naturally. This was the genius of the arrangement, warmth that appeared without being summoned, that could be received without being requested. The scriptorium benefited particularly from these arrangements. The work of copying manuscripts required steady hands and clear vision, both of which deteriorated rapidly in extreme cold. Ink thickened and refused to flow, parchment became brittle and prone to cracking, and the human body itself rebelled against the delicate motor control required for precise letterwork. A scriptorium positioned adjacent to a strategic chimney could function through winter months when one exposed to full cold could not. The architecture itself became a kind of theology, expressing through stone what words could not say. Walls were built with hollow cores, creating pockets of trapped air that provided insulation. Windows were positioned to maximize southern exposure in winter, catching what little sun penetrated the grey skies. Corridors were designed to block prevailing winds, creating microclimates within the larger cold. Doorways were recessed deep into walls, creating vestibules that trapped cold air and prevented it from rushing directly into living spaces. The thickness of walls, often 3 feet or more, was justified as necessary for structural integrity, but it also created tremendous thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. The cloister, that central courtyard around which monastic life revolved, was itself a thermal instrument. Its enclosed space trapped warmer air during the day, while its covered walkways provided shelter from wind and precipitation. The orientation of the cloister relative to prevailing winds was never random but carefully calculated. At monasteries in exposed locations, the cloister was often positioned on the south side of the church, where the massive stone structure of the nave provided a windbreak from the north. These choices required knowledge, an understanding of how heat moves, how air flows, how stone conducts and retains temperature. Some of this knowledge came from Roman ruins, from the hypocaust systems that had once heated bathhouses and villas across Europe. Monks in their travels and studies would have encountered these ancient structures, seen how heated air moved through spaces beneath floors, and adapted the principles to their own austere purposes. The Roman past, pagan and luxurious, provided technical solutions that could be baptized, as it were, into Christian service. The continuity between Roman engineering and medieval monastic architecture is visible in the ruins themselves. At sites where monasteries were built near or upon Roman settlements, the heating channels often follow patterns remarkably similar to ancient hypocaust systems. But the adaptation was never simple copying. The monks modified and refined these techniques, making them smaller, more discreet, less obviously luxurious. Where Romans had heated entire rooms to bathhouse temperatures, monks sought only to take the edge off killing cold. But much of the knowledge was experiential, accumulated over generations of cold winters. A master mason, himself perhaps a lay brother, or a monk who had trained in construction before taking vows, would understand that a wall built with 2 layers of stone and a gap between them would hold warmth better than a solid wall. He would know that a floor laid over a cavity would be less punishing to bare feet than one laid directly on earth. He would understand that glazed windows, though expensive, created a barrier to wind while admitting light, and that even oiled parchment stretched across window openings was better than nothing at all. This knowledge was never written down in the form of plans or treatises. It lived in the hands of craftsmen, in the unspoken wisdom of those who built, and it manifested in structures that appeared austere but were, in subtle ways, merciful. The transmission of this knowledge from master to apprentice, from one generation of builders to the next, created an invisible lineage of compassion embedded in stone. Each monastery built upon the lessons of those that came before, refining techniques, discovering new compromises. The oral tradition of building knowledge meant that innovations could spread without leaving documentary evidence. A mason who had worked on one abbey would carry his techniques to the next project, sharing insights with other craftsmen over meals or during the quiet moments of construction. These conversations, never recorded, were nevertheless the primary means by which architectural compassion propagated across Europe. The stones themselves became a form of literature, legible to those who knew how to read them. At the Abbey of Fontfroide in southern France, researchers discovered something even more remarkable, a network of ceramic pipes embedded in the walls of the chapter house, designed to carry heated water from the kitchen's fires. The system was crude by modern standards. The pipes leaked, the heat loss was enormous, but it represented an extraordinary investment of effort and ingenuity for a community that claimed to reject comfort. Why would monks sworn to poverty and hardship engineer such a system? The answer, perhaps, lies in the difference between suffering chosen for spiritual growth and suffering that simply destroys. Medieval monks understood, in ways that their written rules could not quite express, that there was a threshold beyond which cold ceased to be a teacher and became only a killer. They had seen brothers die in winter, had watched the elderly and infirm succumb to pneumonia and frostbite, had learned through bitter experience where that threshold lay. The death records from medieval monasteries, sparse as they are, show clear spikes in mortality during the harshest winter months. These patterns would not have been lost on communities that maintained careful records of their dead. Each loss reinforced the understanding that some level of warmth was not luxury, but necessity. The spiritual value of cold asceticism had to be balanced against the practical reality that dead monks could not pray, could not copy manuscripts, could not maintain the community that gave their suffering meaning. The infirmary, where sick and elderly monks resided, was always the most heated space in the monastery, and no one questioned this exception. Warmth, in that context, was clearly medicinal, necessary for survival. But the line between medicine and comfort was blurry, and monks learned to blur it further through careful design and strategic silence. What began as accommodation for the sick gradually expanded almost imperceptibly to encompass the aged, the weak, the novices not yet hardened to monastic rigor. At some abbeys, the definition of infirmary became elastic, encompassing not just those who were actively ill, but those who might become ill without additional care. This semantic flexibility created spaces where warmth could exist without challenging the rule directly. An elderly monk who had served faithfully for 40 years might be assigned to the infirmary not because he was sick, but because the community recognized that another winter in the unheated dormitory would kill him. The medical pretext provided cover for what was essentially an act of mercy, a way of honoring faithful service while maintaining the fiction of strict adherence to rule. The clothing, too, was more sophisticated than it appeared. The simple woolen habit, worn in layers, created an effective insulation system. The outer layer blocked wind, the inner layer trapped air, and the body's heat, minimal as it was, accumulated in the space between. Monks who had served for decades learned to layer differently depending on the season, adding extra tunics underneath their habits in ways that were not visible to observers. Wool itself was carefully chosen and prepared. The coarser outer fleece provided wind resistance, while softer inner layers sat against the skin, wicking moisture away from the body, moisture that, in winter, could turn deadly cold. The processing of wool for monastic habits was a craft in itself, understood by the lay brothers who typically managed the sheep flocks and textile production. They knew which breeds of sheep produced the warmest fleece, which time of year to shear for maximum insulation value, how to card and spin the wool to create fabric that was both durable and warm. This knowledge, like so much else in monastic life, was practical theology, a way of caring for brothers through the patient, skilled transformation of raw materials into protection against the elements. The habit that looked identical from monastery to monastery might vary significantly in its thermal properties, reflecting local wool sources and processing techniques refined over generations. Some monasteries provided sheepskin vests worn under the habit for the oldest brothers. These were never mentioned in visitation records or financial accounts, but they appear in archaeological finds, fragments of leather and wool sewn together in simple vests preserved in the dry conditions of crypts and cellars. Their very existence suggests a community conspiracy of care, a collective agreement to protect the vulnerable even when the rules seemed to forbid protection. The silence surrounding these garments was absolute. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge that the rule required modification, that human frailty demanded accommodation. The discovery of these vests in burial contexts is particularly poignant. Monks were typically buried in their habits, the simple woolen garment that had clothed them in life, accompanying them into death. That some were buried wearing these hidden sheepskin vests suggests they were not occasional accommodations, but essential elements of survival, worn constantly, integral to the wearer's existence. The care with which they were constructed, small, even stitches, leather carefully softened, speaks to the value placed on the lives they protected. The straw mattresses, dismissed in earlier descriptions as uncomfortable and inadequate, were actually carefully engineered for their purpose. Straw, when packed properly, provides significant insulation, much more than sleeping directly on wood or stone. The mattresses were replaced seasonally with fresh straw in autumn to provide maximum warmth through winter, and the old straw was not wasted but used as insulation, stuffed into wall gaps or laid under floorboards. This cycle of renewal and repurposing reflected a practical wisdom about resources and survival. The choice of straw itself mattered. Oat straw, with its hollow stems, trapped more air than wheat straw and thus insulated better. Rye straw was longer and more durable, maintaining its structure through a full season of use. Monasteries with their own farms could control what grains they grew, and the choice was never purely about food production. The agricultural decisions made in spring had thermal consequences the following winter, when those same plants, threshed and dried, became the barrier between a monk's body and the cold floor beneath. The rhythm of the agricultural year thus intertwined with the rhythm of thermal survival in ways that were rarely made explicit but universally understood. The cellarer, who managed the monastery's material resources, had to think months ahead, ensuring that sufficient quantities of the right types of straw were set aside for mattress making. This forward planning required a kind of double knowledge, understanding both the spiritual calendar that structured monastic life and the practical calendar of thermal necessity. The two were never in conflict precisely because they were never fully articulated as separate systems. Even the schedule of the divine office, which seems at first like pure spiritual structure, has a practical thermal component. By waking monks multiple times through the night for prayer, the schedule prevented deep sleep in dangerously cold conditions. A body that wakes periodically moves, generates heat, avoids the slow hypothermia that can occur during extended winter sleep. The offices warmed the monks through movement, through the metabolic heat of chanting, through the shared breath of community prayer. The night offices in particular, matins and lauds, celebrated in the darkest hours before dawn, forced circulation and consciousness during the most dangerous part of the winter night. When monks gathered in the choir, their collective body heat raised the temperature of the church by several degrees, creating a pocket of relative warmth in the vast cold space. The physics of communal warmth were not lost on monastic communities. 100 men standing close together in a stone church generated measurable heat, their breath visible in the cold air, their bodies functioning collectively as a source of warmth that none could produce individually. The very act of gathering for prayer thus had thermal benefits that reinforced the spiritual emphasis on community. Isolation was spiritually dangerous, but it was also physically dangerous in winter. A monk alone in his cell could freeze, but monks together in choir created their own microclimate of survival. This intersection of theology and survival creates a strange beauty when examined closely. Every aspect of monastic life that seems designed for spiritual discipline also serves a practical function in managing cold. Prayer generates warmth through exertion. Fasting reduces the body's heat needs. Silence conserves energy. Work creates motion and heat. The monastic day, viewed through the lens of thermal survival, becomes a carefully calibrated machine for keeping humans alive in conditions that should kill them. The hours of manual labor in the afternoon, when temperatures peaked, maximized the body's ability to generate and store heat for the coming night. But to say this too baldly would be to miss something essential. The monks themselves would not have seen it this way, or, if they did, they would not have admitted it. For them, the spiritual was not a disguise for the practical. Both were true simultaneously. Prayer did warm the body, but its purpose was to warm the soul. Work did generate heat, but its purpose was to humble pride through labor. The fact that devotion served survival did not diminish its sacred character. Rather, it suggested that the divine was present in the very structures of physical existence, that grace worked through ordinary matter. This theology of incarnation, the belief that spirit and matter were intertwined, That the divine could manifest in physical reality provided the intellectual framework for understanding how heating channels and prayer could both be holy. The Cistercians in particular emphasized that labor was prayer, that working with hands and materials was a form of devotion as valid as chanting psalms. Within this worldview, building heating channels was not a compromise with spiritual ideals, but an expression of them, a recognition that caring for the body was also caring for the soul housed within it. The stone carved to carry warmth was itself a form of prayer, shaped by hands that worked in devotion. In the Abbey church at Citeaux, the mother house of the Cistercian order, there is a floor stone that bears the faint outline of generations of feet. Monks knelt there for centuries, their bare skin against cold stone, and the pressure and friction of their devotion wore away the rock itself. Looking at that worn stone, one sees both suffering and persistence, both austerity and incredible, stubborn survival. The depression in the stone is shallow, perhaps half an inch at its deepest, but it represents millions of genuflections, decades upon decades of knees meeting stone in prayer. The stone records what documents do not, the sheer physical reality of devotion sustained across time. Each slight depression in the floor, each worn step, each smoothed corner tells of bodies that endured, of a persistence that measured itself not in days or years, but in generations. The cumulative weight of all those moments of prayer quite literally reshaped stone. If devotion could do that to rock, what did it do to the human spirit? The mystery of how monks survived winter is, in the end, not really a mystery of architecture or clothing or heating systems. Those things helped, certainly, but they were not sufficient. The real mystery is one of psychology, of the human capacity to endure through meaning. Without the framework of faith, without the conviction that suffering served a transcendent purpose, no amount of hidden heating channels or woolen vests would have been enough. When suffering has no purpose, it breaks the spirit quickly. But when suffering is understood as a path, whether to holiness, to discipline, to communion with Christ's suffering, it becomes bearable, even transformative. The monks survived winter, not because they were warm, but because they believed their coldness meant something. This belief was not naive or delusional. It was a conscious choice, renewed each day, to interpret experience through a lens of meaning rather than meaninglessness. The power of narrative to sustain human beings through hardship is well documented by modern psychology, but medieval monks understood it experientially. They had to reconstruct meaning each morning when they woke to darkness and cold, had to choose again to believe that their suffering was purposeful. This was not a single decision made once and then forgotten, but a continuous act of will, repeated daily through winter months that must have seemed endless. The liturgy itself provided the structure for this daily renewal. Each office, each prayer, each reading reinforced the story that suffering had meaning. This belief was reinforced through ritual and symbol. The liturgical year placed Christmas, the celebration of divine warmth entering a cold world, at winter's deepest point. The image of the Christ child born in a stable, vulnerable to cold, gave theological meaning to the monks' own vulnerability. They were not simply suffering, they were participating in a sacred pattern, embodying in their own frozen flesh the mystery of incarnation. The Feast of the Nativity transformed the cold dormitory into a metaphorical stable, the shivering monks into witnesses to divine fragility. This connection between their suffering and Christ's suffering was not abstract theology but lived reality, felt in every cold breath. The Christmas liturgy, celebrated at midnight in the coldest part of winter, took on profound resonance in this context. When monks sang of the Word made flesh, dwelling among us, they were singing about the divine entering fully into the human condition, including cold, vulnerability, and physical discomfort. Their own cold bodies became icons of incarnation, living reminders that God had chosen to experience human limitation. This was powerful theology precisely because it was embodied theology, learned through the body rather than merely thought by the mind. The mystics among them went further, describing cold as a form of purification, a burning away of attachment through its opposite. Julian of Norwich, though not a monk, but an anchorite living in similarly austere conditions, wrote of divine warmth that came not from fire but from love, a heat that melts the soul as the sun melts snow, but leaves it more itself, not less. This paradox, that true warmth comes from surrendering the need for warmth, runs through medieval spiritual writing like a hidden stream. It suggests that the monk's relationship with cold was more complex than simple endurance. Cold became, for them, a kind of teacher, revealing desires and attachments, showing where the self clung to comfort and where it could release. In this sense, winter was not an enemy, but a severe friend, stripping away illusions, exposing the bare structure of the soul. The spiritual tradition of holy indifference, the cultivation of equanimity in the face of changing circumstances, found its testing ground in winter's cold. To remain inwardly peaceful, whether warm or cold, comfortable or uncomfortable, was the goal. Winter provided the opportunity to practice this interior freedom, to discover whether one's faith was dependent on comfortable circumstances or could persist regardless. Many monks discovered to their surprise that after years of winter practice, they had developed a kind of inner stability that external circumstances could not shake. In the manuscript illuminations produced in monastic scriptoriums, winter is often depicted with a strange gentleness. January appears as an old man warming himself by a modest fire, February as a figure wrapped in layers, but neither looks tormented. There is acceptance in these images, even a kind of peace. The illuminators, working with numb fingers, painted winter not as an enemy but as a companion, harsh but familiar. The ink they used had to be specially prepared for winter work. Too much gum arabic and it would freeze, too little and it would run on the cold parchment. They learned to warm the parchment slightly before applying ink, to breathe on their fingers between strokes, to work in short bursts before the cold made precision impossible. The manuscripts themselves bear witness to winter's presence. Careful examination reveals places where ink flow changed, where letters became slightly irregular, where a scribe clearly paused to warm his hands before continuing. These imperfections were not errors but evidence of conditions under which the work was done. Modern scholars working in climate-controlled rooms look at these manuscripts and can read, in the variations of script, the story of a human being working at the edge of physical capability, persisting, despite cold that made such delicate work nearly impossible. Archaeological work at the Abbey of Heiligenkreuz in Austria uncovered something touching. Beneath the floorboards of the novices' cells, builders had left small caches of charcoal placed there during construction. The charcoal was never meant to be burned. There was no way to burn it safely in those spaces, but it absorbed moisture and released a gentle, steady warmth through slow oxidation. It was a gift from the builders to future generations of monks, a warmth that lasted for years, invisible and unacknowledged. The discovery of these caches, centuries later, revealed an act of anonymous compassion, a gesture that expected no recognition or reward. Who were these builders? Perhaps lay brothers, perhaps hired craftsmen, perhaps monks who had worked in construction before taking vows. But whoever they were, they understood that the harsh rule and the human need could coexist, that mercy could be built into stone without being spoken aloud. They knew that the novices, young men newly arrived from warmer homes, would struggle most in their first winters, and they left them this secret gift. The charcoal caches were positioned precisely where they would do the most good, under the spots where novices would sleep, where their body heat combined with the charcoal's gentle oxidation to create marginally warmer sleeping spaces. The calculation required to place them correctly suggests builders who had thought deeply about thermal dynamics and human vulnerability. That they did this work, knowing it would never be acknowledged, that the novices who benefited would never know of the gift they had received, speaks to a kind of generosity that expected no return. This was mercy in its purest form, help given invisibly, asking nothing, content to remain forever unknown. The secret warmth of silence, this is perhaps the best way to describe it. Warmth that existed in the gaps of the rule, in the unspoken agreements of community, in the architecture that provided without seeming to provide. It was warmth that could not be claimed or demanded, only received with gratitude when it appeared, always unexpectedly, always as if by grace. This quality of giftedness was essential. Warmth that was guaranteed would be comfort, but warmth that arrived as surprise remained within the bounds of ascetic acceptability. In the long winter nights of medieval monasteries, when snow piled against walls and wind howled through cloisters, monks lay in their cold cells and prayed. And sometimes, rarely, they experienced what they described as a warmth descending, not physical, not measurable, but unmistakably real. They called it consolation, the sense of being held in the palm of God's hand, warmed by a presence that had nothing to do with fire. These experiences were recorded carefully in spiritual journals and letters, described with a precision that suggests their profound importance in sustaining monastic life. Were these experiences real? Modern skeptics might call them endorphin responses, the brain's way of coping with extreme stress. But for the monks, the question of mechanism was irrelevant. The warmth they felt was real in its effects, real in the strength it gave them to face another day, another night, another season of cold devotion. The phenomenology of these experiences was remarkably consistent across different accounts. A sudden sense of warmth beginning at the heart and spreading through the limbs, accompanied by profound peace and sometimes tears, lasting anywhere from moments to hours. Monks described feeling physically warmer during and after these experiences, though no external temperature change had occurred. The consolation carried them through the remainder of winter with renewed strength, as if the brief touch of divine presence had replenished something essential that cold and hardship had depleted. The ruins of these monasteries today are silent, their roofs gone, their walls crumbling, their hidden heating channels exposed to weather. Walking through them in winter, you feel the cold immediately. There is no shelter now, no subtle architecture of warmth. The stones remember nothing. Or if they do, they remember without emotion, the way rock remembers the movement of glaciers. The wind passes through empty window frames where glass or parchment once provided some barrier, and snow collects in choir stalls where monks once stood, shoulder to shoulder, sharing body heat. But stand still in those ruins, in the rectangle that was once the warming house or the space that was once a dormitory, and you might feel something else. Not warmth, exactly, but a presence. The accumulated devotion of generations, the echo of lives lived in faithful endurance. It is a presence made of absence, of cold stones that once sheltered cold bodies, of silence that once held prayer. The very emptiness of the ruins becomes a kind of witness, testifying to what was once born and believed. At Rievaulx, if you stand in the dormitory undercroft where those heating channels run, you can still see the marks where builders carved the stone with remarkable precision. The channels are just wide enough for heated air to flow, just narrow enough to retain structural integrity, a balance that required both calculation and intuition. Running your hand along these channels, you touch something that hands 8 centuries ago shaped with care, knowing that other hands, other bodies, would depend on this work for survival. The stone is cold now, permanently cold, but it remembers warmth the way a riverbed remembers water, in the shape it takes, in the purpose for which it was formed. The mystery remains, softly glowing in the winter dusk. How did they survive? The answer comes back in whispers. Through stone and silence, through hidden channels and unspoken care, through faith that burned without consuming, through a warmth that asks nothing of fire. They survived through the accumulated wisdom of generations, through small mercies embedded in architecture, through the human capacity to find meaning in hardship. They survived because survival itself became a form of prayer, an embodiment of the belief that life, even cold, uncomfortable, austere life, was sacred and worth preserving. And perhaps most profoundly, they survived through community. The hidden heating systems required collective knowledge to build and maintain. The unspoken agreements about extra clothing required communal consent. The strategic silences about architectural compassion required everyone's participation. No single monk could have survived those winters alone, but together, bound by rule and faith and the shared ordeal of cold, they created something larger than themselves, a community that protected its members even when it could not admit to doing so. This was warmth of a different order, the warmth of belonging, of being known and held within a web of mutual care that transcended the spoken rules. The community functioned as a distributed system of survival, each member contributing to the collective endurance. An elderly monk who could no longer work in the fields might spend winter afternoons in the warming house, tending the fire that provided heat for the complex systems below. A skilled mason, even in old age, would pass his knowledge to younger brothers, ensuring that when repairs were needed, someone would know how to maintain the hidden channels. The collective memory of the community held survival knowledge that no single individual possessed completely. In the manuscripts they copied through those long, cold seasons, in the prayers they chanted in frozen churches, in the buildings they constructed with hands that knew both craft and compassion, medieval monks left evidence of a profound truth: that humans can endure almost anything if they believe it matters, if they are not alone, if somewhere in the architecture of their world, visible or hidden, there is provision for their survival. The channels beneath the floors, the charcoal beneath the boards, the strategic placement of chimneys, the secrets sewn into habits, all these testify to communities that found ways to honor both the letter of their austere calling and the reality of human need. They navigated the impossible tension between suffering and survival with a creativity born of necessity and refined through centuries of winter. Today, in an age of central heating and insulated buildings, their struggle seems distant, almost incomprehensible. Yet something in their solution, the way they balanced principle and pragmatism, ideal and reality, rule and mercy, speaks across centuries. They show us that strictness need not mean cruelty, that discipline can coexist with compassion, that the harshest demands of faith can be met without abandoning care for the vulnerable. They achieved this not through explicit revision of their rules, but through the subtle art of interpretation, through knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to build openly and when to hide kindness in stone. The relevance of their example extends beyond religious contexts. In any system where high ideals meet human limitation, where principles must be applied to real bodies living in real conditions, the monastic solution offers a model. It suggests that fidelity to principles need not require rigidity, that compassion can operate within strict systems without destroying them, that sometimes the most principled action is the one never acknowledged. The monks teach us that mercy and discipline are not opposites, but partners in the work of creating sustainable human communities. In the end, the secret warmth of medieval monasteries was not really secret at all. Everyone knew about the heating channels, the extra tunics, the strategic architecture, They simply agreed not to speak of them, not to make explicit what worked better, as an open secret. This collective discretion protected both the integrity of the rule and the survival of those who lived under it, creating a space where mercy could operate without undermining discipline. It was a solution as elegant as it was necessary, as theological as it was practical. And so the stones endure, hollowed and channeled, bearing witness to winters long past and monks long dead. The wind blows through empty cloisters where once men prayed and shivered, where once heating channels carried their modest freight of warmth, where once communities conspired in silence to keep each other alive. The mystery of their survival is no mystery at all, finally. It is simply the old story of human ingenuity meeting human need, of communities learning to care for their own without admitting they were doing so, of grace working through stone and silence and the stubborn refusal to let winter win. It is the story of warmth that needed no acknowledgement to be real, of mercy that worked best when it remained unspoken, of survival achieved not through softening the rule, but through understanding that rules exist to preserve life, not destroy it. The channels remain empty now, but eloquent, speaking a language of care that transcends time. They tell us that survival and principle need not be enemies, that communities can hold both ideals and compassion, that the highest faithfulness sometimes requires the deepest silence. In winter light, when frost coats the ruins and the low sun casts long shadows through broken arches, the old monasteries seem less dead than sleeping. The cold that fills them now is the same cold that filled them 8 centuries ago, but it no longer meets resistance. There are no bodies to warm, no prayers to breathe into the frozen air, no communities conspiring silently to preserve each other. Yet the architecture remains, still bearing its hidden testimony, still whispering its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. The heating channels run nowhere now, carrying only darkness and the occasional scurrying of small creatures who have made homes in spaces once reserved for warmth. But their existence continues to matter, continues to teach. They remind us that the most important care is often the care we cannot name, that the deepest mercy operates in silence, that sometimes the most sacred work is the work no one acknowledges. The stones, in their mute persistence, preach a sermon more powerful than any abbot's words, a sermon about the necessity of hidden kindness, about the holiness of survival, about the way communities sustain themselves through unspoken agreements to protect the vulnerable. The medieval monks who built these systems, who maintained them through centuries, who benefited from them while pretending they did not exist, have been dead for hundreds of years. But their solution to the problem of winter endures not as physical warmth that has long since dissipated, but as a pattern of wisdom. They showed that it is possible to honor harsh ideals without killing those who attempt to live by them, that rules can be preserved while human beings are also preserved, that the letter of the law and the spirit of mercy can coexist if communities are willing to inhabit the creative space between silence and speech. This lesson, learned through cold and embodied in stone, remains relevant to any community that must balance principle and survival. When we visit these ruins today, we come as tourists or scholars, warmed by modern clothing, certain of heated buildings waiting for us when we leave. We cannot truly know what it was to live here, to spend winter after winter in these spaces, to depend on these small provisions for survival. But we can try to imagine, can stand in the cold until our fingers ache, can listen to the wind and feel the stones chill, and in that small discomfort begin to understand the magnitude of what was endured. The gap between our brief cold and their sustained winter is vast, but even that glimpse helps us appreciate the extraordinary resilience of communities that made these places home. The most haunting aspect of these ruins is not what remains, but what has vanished. The heating channels are visible now, exposed by collapsed floors and missing roofing, but the warmth they carried is gone forever. The spaces where monks slept, where they prayed, where they gathered briefly in the warming house, are now indistinguishable from the cold outside. All the careful engineering, all the subtle architecture of survival has been rendered inert by the passage of time and the loss of the communities that gave these systems purpose. Yet even in their emptiness, the ruins testify. They prove that the systems existed, that the care was real, that the conspiracy of silence protected real lives through real winters. The archaeological evidence contradicts the documentary silence, and in that contradiction we find the truth that medieval monastic communities were more complex, more human, more merciful than their own chronicles admitted. The stones do not lie, even when the parchment remains silent. Modern historians examining these findings must revise their understanding of medieval monastic life. The older narrative of monks enduring winter through pure spiritual fortitude, unassisted by any material comfort, gives way to a more nuanced picture. These were communities that understood the necessity of compromise, that balanced ideal and reality with sophistication, that cared for their members while maintaining their collective identity as ascetics. The revision does not diminish their achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable, showing that they survived not through superhuman endurance, but through human wisdom. The lesson extends beyond monasteries, beyond medieval Europe, beyond religious communities entirely. Any institution that demands high standards of its members must grapple with the same tension: how to maintain principles without destroying people, how to honor ideals while accommodating human limitation. The monastic solution, providing necessary support while maintaining silence about it, building mercy into the infrastructure while leaving the rule unchanged, offers one possible model. It is not the only model, and perhaps not always the best, but it is a solution refined over centuries and proven effective across countless winters. In our own age, we face similar tensions in different contexts. How do we maintain standards in educational institutions while supporting students who struggle? How do we uphold workplace expectations while accommodating human needs for rest and recovery? How do we preserve the ideals that define our communities while recognizing that not everyone can meet those ideals all the time? The medieval monks cannot answer these questions for us, but their example suggests that silence and subtlety, infrastructure and unspoken agreement can sometimes achieve what explicit rule changes cannot. The heating channels beneath medieval monasteries also remind us of the importance of passing on practical wisdom alongside abstract principles. The masons who carved those channels possessed knowledge that was never written into the monastic rule, but was essential for the rule's survival. Communities need both the articulated ideals that define their purpose and the unarticulated knowledge that makes living by those ideals possible. When the practical wisdom is lost, the ideals become impossible to sustain, and communities fail not because their principles were wrong, but because they lost the know-how to live by them. This knowledge transmission happens best through apprenticeship, through hands working alongside hands, through the patient teaching of one generation by another. It cannot be fully captured in manuals or documents because much of it is tacit, known through the body, through experience, through years of practice. The lay brothers who maintained monastic buildings, the craftsmen who understood stone and heat, the elderly monks who knew which winters were survivable and which required extra care, all carried knowledge that was essential but rarely acknowledged. When we lose these lineages of practical knowledge, we lose more than information. We lose the wisdom that makes ideals livable. As evening falls on the ruins, the cold deepens. The stones release what little warmth they absorbed during the brief winter day, cooling rapidly under darkening skies. This is the time when, centuries ago, monks would have retreated to their cells, would have gathered for compline, the final office of the day, would have lain down on their straw mattresses and pulled thin blankets around them. This is when the hidden channels would have mattered most, when every degree of warmth counted against the long night ahead. Standing in the ruins at this hour, as shadows lengthen and temperature drops, one feels most acutely the absence of the communities that once made these spaces human. The architecture without its inhabitants is like a body without breath. All the structure remains, but the animating presence is gone. The stones can teach us how the monks survived physically, but they cannot convey the full texture of that survival. The prayers whispered in darkness, the small kindnesses exchanged in silence, the interior spiritual warmth that sustained them when physical warmth failed. That dimension of their experience is lost to us, accessible only through imagination and the fragmentary evidence of their writings. Yet even that lost dimension matters because it reminds us that survival is never purely physical. The heating channels helped the monks endure, but they survived ultimately because they had reasons to survive, because their lives had meaning and purpose that transcended comfort. This integration of physical provision and spiritual purpose is what made their solution work. Neither alone would have sufficed, but together they created conditions where human life could persist through extraordinary hardship. We cannot separate the thermal engineering from the theological framework that gave it meaning. They were aspects of a single comprehensive approach to the problem of winter. The stars emerge as full darkness falls, the same stars medieval monks would have seen on clear winter nights. The constancy of the heavens contrasts with the transience of human communities, with the rise and fall of the monasteries that once thrived here. Those monks looked up at these stars and saw the unchanging order of creation, saw evidence of divine governance, saw reminders that their suffering was temporary against the backdrop of eternity. The cold night sky that might have seemed hostile instead offered comfort, proof that there was an order beyond chaos, a permanence beyond their temporary discomfort. In the ruins, in winter, in the gathering dark, we stand at the intersection of past and present, of absence and presence, of cold stone and warm memory. The monks are gone, their communities dissolved, their voices silent for centuries. But what they learned about survival, about community, about the balance between principle and mercy, persists in the architecture they left behind. The channels remain, the walls endure, the stones speak their silent testimony. And in that testimony we find not just historical curiosity but lived wisdom, practical, tested, refined through generations of winter. We find evidence that human communities, when faced with seemingly impossible demands, can discover solutions that honor both their highest ideals and their deepest needs. We find proof that mercy and discipline are not opposites but partners, that the harshest rules can be preserved when communities are wise enough to build compassion into their infrastructure, that survival and sanctity can coexist when people are willing to care for each other in silence. This is the secret warmth that still radiates from these cold stones, the warmth of human wisdom, of communal care, of creative fidelity to principle and person alike. The winter wind moves through the ruins, cold and indifferent, caring nothing for history or human meaning. But we who visit these places, who study their architecture and ponder their lessons, are not indifferent. We recognize in these stones a human story worth preserving, a solution worth remembering, a pattern of wisdom worth passing on. The monks who survived here have taught us something essential about the art of endurance, about the necessity of unspoken care, about the way communities sustain themselves through the hardest seasons. As we leave the ruins and return to our heated cars, our insulated homes, our climate-controlled lives, we carry with us this knowledge, that warmth, whether physical or spiritual, individual or communal, is always a gift. That survival is never simple or automatic, but requires wisdom, care, and the willingness to provide for others without demanding recognition. That the highest ideals are sustained not by rigidity, but by flexibility, not by harshness, but by hidden mercy, not by speaking every truth aloud, but by knowing which truths to embed silently in the structure of communal life. This is what the ruins teach, what the stones remember, what the winter cold makes visible, the secret warmth that sustained communities through centuries of hardship, the grace that worked through silence and stone to keep fragile human life alive against the killing cold. The lesson endures, quiet and persistent as the stones themselves, waiting for anyone willing to stand in the cold long enough to understand. While monks shivered in stone cells, practicing their cold devotion, another world existed, sometimes only a few miles away, sometimes within the same valley. This was the world of castles and manor houses, of lords and ladies who faced winter not with austerity, but with every resource their wealth could command. The contrast was not merely one of comfort, though comfort certainly divided them. It was a contrast of philosophy, of what winter meant and how one ought to meet it. For the monk, winter was a test. For the noble, it was a challenge to be defeated through display, through the aggressive assertion of human will over nature's harshness. In the great hall of a castle like Chateau de Vincennes or Bolton Castle, winter was met with fire on a scale unimaginable to the monastic world. The central hearth, often 10 feet wide or more, burned continuously from October to April, consuming entire trees at a time. Servants hauled logs from forests that existed primarily for this purpose. Whole woodlands managed solely to feed the appetite of noble fires. The heat from these fires was immense, transforming the hall into a space that sweltered at its center while remaining draughty at its edges. Lords and their families sat close to the flames, their faces flushed with heat, while servants and lesser members of the household occupied the colder periphery. Even within privilege, hierarchy was enforced through proximity to warmth. The walls of the hall were hung with tapestries, not simply for decoration, though they were certainly decorative, but for insulation. These woven panels, often depicting hunting scenes or biblical stories, created a barrier between the cold stone and the warm air, reducing heat loss and blocking drafts. The richest families owned dozens of tapestries, rotating them seasonally, hanging the thickest and most ornate during winter months. At night, the hall's fire was banked but not extinguished, maintained by a servant whose sole duty was to tend it through the dark hours. This position, firekeeper or hearthward, was one of trust and responsibility, because a fire allowed to die meant a day of cold while new flames were kindled, and in the coldest months rekindling was not always easy or quick. The private chambers of the lord and lady, located in towers or upper floors where security was greatest, were heated by smaller fireplaces, but these were marvels of engineering in their own right. Chimneys carried smoke upward and outward, a technology that had taken centuries to develop properly and that remained imperfect. Chambers often filled with smoke when the wind blew wrong, and deaths from smoke inhalation were not uncommon. Beneath the beds of nobles were placed braziers, metal vessels filled with hot coals or heated stones, designed to warm the sleeping space without the risk of open flame. These braziers were prepared by servants in the evening, the coals carefully selected from the hall fire, wrapped in metal containers with perforated lids that allowed heat to escape while containing the fire itself. The beds themselves were structures of elaborate defense against cold. 4 poster frames supported heavy curtains of wool or velvet that could be drawn closed, creating a small insulated chamber within the larger cold room. Inside this enclosed space, the sleeper's body heat accumulated, and with the addition of the brazier's warmth, the temperature could approach something like comfort. Layers of bedding added further protection, a base of straw or feathers, then linen sheets, then wool blankets, then furs, bear, wolf, fox, ermine, depending on wealth and status. Some beds had as many as 10 layers of covering, each adding insulation and weight, pressing down on the sleeper in a way that was both comforting and suffocating. The clothing of nobles in winter was similarly layered and elaborate. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, fur-lined robes, heavy cloaks. Each layer served both practical and symbolic functions. Fur, in particular, was a mark of status. The quality and rarity of the fur announced the wearer's position in the social hierarchy. Ermine, with its white winter coat dotted with black tail-tips, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Yet, even with all these advantages, nobles were not truly warm. They were merely less cold than everyone else. Castles, for all their grandeur, were fundamentally difficult structures to heat. Built for defense, with thick walls and narrow windows, they were designed to keep enemies out, not cold. The very features that made them secure made them inhospitable to comfort. Drafts were constant, flowing through arrow slits and murder holes around ill-fitting doors and shutters. The stone walls, several feet thick, absorbed heat from the interior and radiated cold from the exterior, creating a thermal sink that no amount of fire could fully overcome. On the coldest nights, water in ewers froze, despite being kept in heated chambers, and breath condensed on tapestries, leaving them damp and heavy. The daily life of nobles in winter revolved around managing and displaying their access to warmth. Meals in the great hall were elaborate affairs, with multiple courses and dozens of dishes, all designed to showcase abundance in a season of scarcity. The food itself was a form of heat, rich, fatty, heavily spiced, intended to fuel the body's internal fires against the external cold. Wine and ale flowed freely, their alcohol providing a sense of warmth that was partly real and partly illusion. Mulled wine, heated with spices and honey, was a winter specialty, served in metal cups that retained heat and burned the lips if drunk too quickly. The spices themselves, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, were luxury imports, their heat on the tongue a reminder of distant warm lands and the lord's ability to command goods from across the known world. Entertainment, too, took on particular importance in winter. With outdoor activities like hunting and hawking curtailed by weather, the hall became a stage for music, storytelling, games and displays of various kinds. These gatherings served practical purposes. They kept people active and distracted from discomfort, but they also reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. The Lord presided over these events from his position nearest the fire, and the arrangement of seating was a precise map of status and favour. To be invited closer to the hearth was a sign of honour. To be relegated to the cold edges was a subtle punishment or reminder of one's lesser importance. Yet the nobility's relationship with winter was not only one of opposition and defence. There was also a romanticization, a tendency to see winter as a season of testing that proved noble character. The harsh weather became a backdrop for demonstrations of bravery, generosity, and lordly virtue. Winter was when the noble's obligation to provide for his household and his lands was most visible. A lord who kept his people fed through the lean months, who maintained his hall as a place of warmth and refuge, who gave generously to the poor and the church, such a lord demonstrated the qualities that justified his privilege. Winter was his stage, and his performance was closely watched. The great winter feasts, Christmas above all, but also Twelfth Night and Candlemas, were elaborate displays of this generosity. The Lord opened his hall to all his household, and often to many beyond it, providing food, warmth, and entertainment on a scale that deliberately exceeded practicality. The excess was the point. It demonstrated power, wealth, and largesse. These feasts often included the poor of the estate, who were admitted to the lower end of the hall and fed from the Lord's table. This was charity, certainly, but it was also theatre, a performance of feudal obligation in which the social order was both displayed and reinforced. The poor were warmed and fed, but they were also reminded of their dependence on noble generosity. Christmas itself, though a religious feast, took on particular intensity in noble households. The hall was decorated with evergreen boughs, holly, ivy, mistletoe, plants that remained green through winter, and thus symbolized continuity of life through death's season. The Yule log, an enormous piece of wood chosen to burn for 12 days, was dragged to the hall with ceremony and lit with great fanfare. The burning of the Yule log was more than practical heating. It was ritual, a way of marking time and creating communal identity. Pieces of the log were saved from year to year, kept to kindle the next year's fire, creating a chain of flame stretching backward and forward through time. In this way, the noble fire, like the monastic prayer, became a link to past and future, a way of asserting human continuity against winter's erasure. But beneath the pageantry and display, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety. Winter was unpredictable, and even the wealthy were vulnerable to its extremes. A particularly harsh season could deplete even well-stocked storerooms. Supply chains could be disrupted by impassable roads, by frozen rivers, by storms that lasted weeks. The lord who seemed secure in October might face shortage by February. Historical accounts record winters when even castles ran short of food, when the wine froze in its barrels, when servants fell ill from cold despite the presence of fires. In such times, the distance between noble comfort and monastic austerity narrowed considerably. The lord might still have his fire, but if the wood ran out, if the stores were exhausted, his privilege provided no protection against hunger and cold. There were, too, the practical dangers that came with aggressive heating. Castles caught fire with disturbing regularity, often started by sparks from fireplaces or overheated braziers. The wooden beams that supported stone structures were vulnerable to flame, and once fire took hold in the dry wood and tapestries of a noble chamber, it spread with terrifying speed. Deaths from fire and smoke were recorded in chronicles and legal documents. A lady suffocated by smoke while sleeping, her bed curtains having trapped fumes from a brazier. A child burned when a curtain caught fire from a candle. A lord who fell asleep too close to the hearth and did not wake when his robe ignited. These tragedies reveal that even warmth came at a cost, that comfort and danger lived side by side. The nobility also maintained a complex relationship with the Church's teaching about suffering and austerity. They attended Mass, heard sermons about the spiritual value of poverty and discomfort, and then returned to their heated halls and comfortable beds. Some felt genuine guilt about this contradiction. Others rationalized it by arguing that their comfort was necessary to their role as providers and protectors. Certain nobles, particularly in their later years, made gestures toward monastic simplicity. They might fast more strictly, give up their furs for coarse wool, or even, in some cases, retreat to monasteries themselves, seeking the cold stone and simple food they had spent their lives avoiding. These conversions were seen as particularly pious, a triumph of spirit over flesh, but they were possible only because the nobleman had first experienced both extremes and chosen austerity from a position of knowledge rather than necessity. The architectural decisions of castle building reflected this tension between defense and comfort. Later medieval castles included more sophisticated heating systems, larger windows with better-fitting shutters, chambers designed specifically for warmth rather than only for security. The evolution of castle architecture is partly an evolution of priorities, from pure military function toward a balance of security and livability. By the 14th and 15th centuries, some noble residences were becoming manor houses rather than true castles, structures that acknowledged the decreased threat of warfare and the increased importance of comfortable living. These buildings had larger fireplaces, better chimneys, more windows with glass panes that admitted light while blocking wind. They represented a slow shift in what the nobility valued, from demonstrating martial prowess to demonstrating refined living. Yet even these advances did not make winter easy. Glass was expensive and fragile. Many windows still used oiled parchment or cloth that admitted light, but also cold. Chimneys, though improved, still smoked. Floors, even with rushes and carpets, remained cold. The transition from castle to manor house was a transition from one form of discomfort to a slightly lesser form, not to true warmth by modern standards. Comparing the noble and the monastic experience of winter reveals a strange paradox. Both groups, in their different ways, turned winter into performance. The monk performed austerity, using cold to demonstrate his dedication to spiritual discipline. The noble performed abundance, using warmth to demonstrate his power and largesse. Both performances were public, intended to be witnessed and judged by their respective audiences, and both performances were, in a sense, incomplete. The monk, for all his rejection of comfort, accepted the small mercies of hidden heating channels and layered habits. The noble, for all his displays of warmth, could not truly escape the cold that seeped through stone and under doors. Neither was as austere or as comfortable as their public presentation suggested. In the end, winter was the great leveler, humbling both the spiritual elite and the social elite. The monk might find holiness in his cold cell, the lord might find power in his warm hall, but both were human bodies vulnerable to cold, both were mortal beings facing a season that cared nothing for their pretensions. The stone remembered nothing, the wind played no favourites, the frost formed its patterns without regard to status or sanctity. Picture two scenes side by side, a monk kneeling in a frozen chapel, his breath rising like incense as he chants, his body barely warmed by the presence of his brothers, a lord seated close to a roaring fire in a tapestry-hung hall, his face flushed with heat and wine, surrounded by servants and guests. Both are facing winter, both are finding ways to survive it, both are using the resources available to them, faith or wealth, austerity or excess. Neither scene is complete without the other. Together they map the range of human response to hardship, from acceptance to resistance, from surrender to defiance. And between these extremes, in the cold space that separated monastery from castle, lived the vast majority, peasants and craftsmen, servants and labourers, people who had neither the monk's spiritual framework nor the lord's material resources, who simply endured because they had no choice. We have walked together through the cold corridors of winter as medieval people knew them. We have felt the stone beneath bare feet, the bite of wind through cloister arches, the ache of hunger and cold that stretched from October to April. We have witnessed endurance and ingenuity, austerity and excess, the many ways that humans found to survive a season that seemed designed to test whether flesh and faith could outlast ice. Brother Gerard, lying in his frozen cell with snow drifting through the window, learned that warmth is not what we possess but what we become. The monks in their collective silence engineered small mercies without acknowledging them, building warmth into stone as a secret gift to future generations. The nobles in their halls performed abundance as a form of power, yet even they could not fully escape the cold that pressed against every wall. What connects these experiences across the divisions of class and calling is the fundamental human need to find meaning in hardship. Winter without purpose is simply suffering, cold that numbs, hunger that weakens, darkness that depresses. But winter, transformed into test, into discipline, into demonstration, becomes something bearable, even precious. The meaning we make from suffering is itself a kind of warmth, invisible but essential. Think now of where you lie or sit in your own warm space, insulated and heated by technologies that medieval people could not have imagined. The warmth that surrounds you, so constant that you likely do not notice it, so reliable that you take it as a given, would have seemed miraculous to Brother Gerard, impossible to the monks chanting in frozen chapels, unthinkable to the nobles huddled close to their insufficient fires. You are warm in ways that require no effort, no sacrifice, no particular virtue. You do not earn your warmth through prayer or through wealth. It simply exists as fundamental as air. And yet, knowing what warmth cost those who came before, perhaps you can feel it differently now, not as a rite or an accident, but as a kind of grace, a gift that countless human beings lived and died without knowing. The monks in their cold cells were seeking something beyond warmth, something they called holiness or communion with God. Whether they found it, we cannot know. But we know they survived generation after generation, that they copied their manuscripts and sang their offices and endured their winters, and that in enduring they left behind not only ruins and relics, but also a record of human capacity, of what can be born when meaning gives shape to suffering. The nobles in their warm halls were seeking something too, power perhaps, or security, or simply the pleasure of being less cold than others. They built their fires high and hung their tapestries thick, and they faced winter as an adversary to be defeated. And they too survived, though their warmth was fragile and their comfort incomplete, though fire could turn against them and no amount of wealth could make winter into summer. Between these extremes, the monk choosing cold, the noble fighting cold, lies perhaps a middle path, a way of neither seeking suffering nor fleeing it excessively, but accepting it as part of the texture of life. Modern comfort has perhaps cost us something, not in moral terms, for there is no virtue in unnecessary suffering, but in terms of awareness, of knowing what our bodies can endure, of understanding the difference between need and want. The medieval winter, for all its harshness, had a clarity that our climate-controlled lives lack. When survival required effort, when warmth was precious because it was rare, people knew what mattered. They knew the value of a fire, the gift of a dry bed, the luxury of a full belly. We know these things intellectually, but we do not feel them in our bones. Do not wake each morning grateful simply for not being cold. Perhaps that is loss, or perhaps it is simply progress. We cannot decide and need not decide, but we can remember as we drift towards sleep in our warm rooms that winter was once much colder, that survival was once much harder, that people endured with grace and ingenuity things we would consider unbearable. The cold stone of medieval monasteries still stands in many places, weathered by centuries, empty of the prayers that once warmed it. Walking through those ruins in winter, you feel the cold immediately, no longer softened by habit and ritual, no longer given meaning by faith, just cold, pure, and indifferent. The stones remember nothing, but we remember. We carry forward the stories of those who lived in those spaces, who found ways to survive that went beyond mere physical technique, who transformed cold into something that could be endured because it meant something. Their warmth, the warmth they created not with fire, but with faith, with community, with the human gift for making meaning, that warmth persists in a way that outlasts any flame. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, imagine for a moment what it would be to lie down in a cold cell, to pull a damp blanket over yourself, to wait for sleep to come in, darkness barely broken by starlight. Imagine the bell that will wake you in a few hours, the cold floor beneath your feet, the endless round of prayer and work that makes up your days. Imagine choosing this freely, believing it brings you closer to something holy. And then let the image fade and feel the warmth that surrounds you, the softness beneath you, the quiet comfort that requires nothing of you. Feel it as the gift it is, earned not by you, but by centuries of human ingenuity, by the accumulated knowledge of generations who slowly, painfully learned how to make winter less harsh. The fire that Brother Gerard wrote about, the fire born in silence, the warmth that comes from something other than flame, that fire burns still in the continuity of human endurance, in the stories we tell about survival, in the knowledge that we are capable of bearing more than we imagine, when we must, when we choose to, when meaning makes the bearing possible. Sleep now, warm and safe as countless generations could not. Let the winter winds blow outside, let the cold press against your windows, and know that you are sheltered not only by walls and heat, but by the long history of human beings, learning to survive the dark seasons, learning to find warmth in the coldest places, learning to endure. The ember glows, then fades, then turns to ash. But before it dies, it kindles another, and the chain continues. Warmth passed from generation to generation, not only as fire, but as knowledge, as story, as the memory of those who came before and survived, so that we might exist in this moment, warm and drifting into sleep. Let yourself drift now. Let the weight of the day settle. Let your breathing slow. Let the warmth cradle you as you slip toward dreams. Somewhere in the darkness, across centuries, Brother Gerard settles into his cold cell and closes his eyes, and his breath rises in the dark, and he sleeps, and survives, and wakes to pray again. And you sleep too in your own time, in your own warmth, connected to him and to all who have faced winter and endured by the simple fact of being human, of needing warmth, of finding ways to survive the cold. The story ends, but the warmth continues, burning quietly in the space between then and now, between cold and comfort, between hardship and peace.